What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video that is perhaps stating the obvious a little bit in that PC gaming hardware is in for a rough year in 2026. Now, I don't think it's all doom and gloom, there's some things to look forward to, but by and large, PC hardware is in a pretty rough place at the moment for a variety of different reasons, and I kind of just wanted to talk a little bit about that situation. So, on the off chance you haven't heard anything about this, one of the primary things happening basically is that the price of current gen RAM is just kind of through the roof at the moment, to the tune of like double what it would normally cost in many cases. This has had cascading effects elsewhere. NVIDIA is just fully skipping 2026 for consumer GPUs so they can take the RAM they do have and put it towards the things that they want to do with AI. There's already rumors that they won't pick up their 60 series until like 2027 or 2028. This has also had knock-on effects elsewhere, like the delay of Valve's Steam machine. Which, by the way, I do want to point out that at the beginning of the year, I like to release a predictions thing, and one of my predictions this year was that we wouldn't see that for less than $1,000, specifically because of the problems we are seeing right now with the RAM shortage. But what is that about? Why is that happening? Well, basically, AI data centers are buying up all the RAM. And while the jury is certainly still out on how long that lasts, that is, again, something that a lot of word of mouth is saying probably around 2028 is when it will ease up. But basically, the entire situation revolves around the fact that RAM prices in particular are very high right now because of all the increased demand. That has driven demand, of course, to previous gen stuff, which, thanks to increased demand, is also a bit more expensive now. Which, as one would expect, means it is very expensive to try to build a PC at the moment. Now, I am a PC channel, obviously, but I don't necessarily think this has to be entirely doom and gloom, though obviously rising costs aren't great for anybody, especially after a lot of upheaval at just the price of games recently. But I do think there is some opportunity here in the form of optimization and things. Now, combine everything we've just talked about, however, with industry shifts. We've seen tons of layoffs, difficulty getting funding via publishers and stuff for all sorts of different projects and the like. So I am not arguing in any way that things are not very difficult in the video game industry at the moment. That is just a fact. However, on the flip side, I don't always think adversity is the worst thing in the world, and if anything, it can be a driver of innovation in and of itself in ways that I think could be helpful, at least in the long term, for PC gaming at least. Now, to give you one very small example of that, I put out a video in, I think it was June or July of last year, 2025, talking about how I really wish Steam would add a PC spec option to its Steam user reviews, like let users opt in to share the specs they are playing the game with. And I'm happy to report that they did that last month, actually. That is a feature that is now available, and you will see, potentially, users' PC specs when you are checking out a recent game title. This is nice for, I think, two reasons. One, it can show you how a game is running for people with a comparable set of hardware, and it could also potentially help developers identify problems with, again, specific configurations, things like that. But that's just one example. Another place that I think we might actually see a bit of movement is hopefully optimization. So if you are limited by the hardware available to most people and you want to work within those confines, you ideally want your game, of course, to run as, let's say, efficiently as possible across that hardware, because people might not necessarily have the extra computing power in order to power through an unoptimized game. There's been a lot of conversations about that in the last few years. Very recently, we saw like High on Life 2 ran pretty poorly on PC, but I understand it did pretty well on PS5. But High on Life 2 is not a particularly impressive game graphically, and yet for some reason the recommended specs for it are a 4080, which is just about a top-of-the-line GPU. And just in looking at that game, I simply do not see how that is really necessary. But basically what I'm getting at here is I think there are opportunities, hopefully, for developers, and I'm not saying this is easy by any stretch of the imagination, simply saying the possibility exists that they are able to focus in on things like art direction and art style over necessarily the most bleeding edge graphics for the next couple of years in order to hopefully deliver more unique experience rather than just chase an ever, let's say, greater diminishing return on graphical improvements, because as people have also noted, that's becoming a more difficult thing and expensive thing to chase as time goes on as well. And while, we all enjoy seeing the incredibly graphically beautiful game here and there, it is, as mentioned, a thing that just has a lot of diminishing return, cost versus effort, things like that. Things don't necessarily need to be hyper-realistic all the time, and I am honestly a pretty big fan of stylized realism anyway. But even just looking at the last couple of years worth of games that have done really well, a lot of them are not necessarily the most graphically impressive titles of all time. They usually have things that hone in on specific aspects of something that make it matter, of course, and yet a lot of them were able to do that for a price point that was cheaper than like full AAA price, which these days is basically $70. Like we've got Claire Obscure, which won Game of the Year last year. And that game is $50 US and doesn't require a supercomputer to run its recommended specs. Though, as you would probably expect, those spaces in general tend to be where things like indies and AA's thrive because they often have to take different approaches that they have the money and ability to actually execute upon. But to simply start moving to wrap some of this up, basically PC hardware is in for probably a rough couple of years. Most people are saying they're not really expecting to see this start to ease up until probably around late 2027, 2028. We are already seeing that have a great impact on current hardware offerings, especially with Valve's Steam Machine, talks of the next console generation, etc., etc. And while that's just kind of happening and we have to live with it, there's not really too much else to be done about that on our end at the moment. I do think, and hope at least, that it might provide an opportunity to, say, refocus on, I would say, things that matter more than, say, graphical power, and build instead upon, unique ideas, gameplay systems, iterate, perhaps even some innovation caused by the necessity of, needing to have to put a constraint on what you are doing. But truth be told, I would say that's probably just the optimist in me. So it's certainly going to be an interesting next couple of years in this industry and well beyond with everything else going on in the world these days. But to that end, I would love to know what you think about all this down in the comment section below, how you see this going, ending up, etc. Which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.